Good evening. Welcome to tonight's lecture, Nova Scotia, almost the 14th American colony, the driving force behind the country of Canada. Tonight we have returning to present this lecture, journalist Evan Weiner. If you like our presentations, you can view some of the previous ones on our YouTube channel. At East Hampton Library. You can also like us on Facebook, and we are at www.easthamptonlibrary.org. And this is Steve Spataro, head of reference at the East Hampton Library. And without further ado, I'll turn over this evening to Evan Weiner.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to the East Hampton Library for inviting me. My name is Evan Weiner, and I've been going up to Halifax for a long time. I used to speak on cruise ships before COVID-19, and if COVID-19 ever levels out, I'll probably go back on cruise ships. But I'll just do things like the California coast and Atlantic Canada. And there's a lot of history in Atlantic Canada that deals with the United States that we really don't learn very much about. Nova Scotia initially was Acadia, and Acadia initially was Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And Prince Edward Island is also the birthplace of Canada. That's where the first meeting took place for the Confederation in 1864, and Canada became a country in Charlottetown. So we'll start at Prince Edward Island, which was initially a part of Nova Scotia. And Prince Edward Island could have been a part of the United States, not during the Revolutionary War, but after the Civil War, when Canada was when Ontario and Quebec and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were putting together this thing called Canada. But Nova Scotia could have been the 14th colony. But PEI started as part of Nova Scotia. In 1604, the Kingdom of France laid claims to the land of the Maritimes under the Discovery Doctrine, including Prince Edward Island, and established the French colony of Acadia. Now, you may be familiar with Acadia for two things. One, Longfellow's poem, or Evangeline, or Acadia National Park in Maine. Prince Edward Island initially was Ile Saint-Jean, St. John's Island, by the French, the local people, the First Nations, not Native Americans, First Nations, the Micmac, never recognized the claim. But they welcomed the French as trading partners and allies because there was money involved there. But things change hands. There are so many wars that are taking place in Europe. 6 of them end up in Nova Scotia. St. John's Island is controlled by the British. The island was administered as part of the colony of Nova Scotia until it was split into a separate colony in 1769. During and after the American Revolutionary War from 1776 to 1783, the colony tried to extract loyalist refugees, the ones that were on the losing side, from the rebellious American colonies, and that met with some success. By the way, the British got Acadia, which included St. John's Island, or renamed St. John's Island. Hello? We gotta mute everybody, don't we? Yes. Okay, we just muted everybody. Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, the British take over New France, which is what it was, in 1763 at the end of the French-Indian War, and so they get all this land. And St. John's is one of these pieces of land. And that is Acadia. That is Acadia today. Today, it's Prince Edward Island. It's New Brunswick. It's Nova Scotia, and it's Maine. Part of Acadia was Maine back in the day, actually Massachusetts. That is what it looks like today. But back during the Revolutionary War days, it was Massachusetts, where Maine is, separated from Nova Scotia, and of course, Prince Edward Island on its own. In 1798, the British named the island colony for Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, and Strathern. He lived between 1767 and 1820. He was the fourth son of, remember him, King George III. He was the one who declared the Americas or the Southern colonists in rebellion. and the father of Queen Victoria. Prince Edward has been called the father of the Canadian crown. And Canada starts in PEI. When you sail into PEI, there are only two options. One, you take a bridge in there, which is connected to New Brunswick, or you sail in and you see the red rocks. They're really a pretty sight, the rusted red rocks as you sail toward Charlottetown. Going to PEI, it was time to form a country in 1864, and there are many reasons for forming a country. One is the Americans to the south, because the people living in Upper Canada, Lower Canada, or province of Canada, were always suspicious that the Americans would invade them. And America had grown, as did Canada, well, the land known as Canada, to the Pacific coast. And there was a civil war, and these people were worried. Although from Nova Scotia, a lot of the Nova Scotians signed up and fought in the Civil War for the North. 1864, 23 representatives from the Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI meet in Charlottetown to discuss the formation of a country. It was the beginning of 3 years' worth of discussions that would lead to the eventual formation of Canada on July 1st, 1867. And I haven't been to the building since it's been renovated, but that's Confederate Hall in Charlottetown. And one of the cool things is you can take a picture in front of it that says 1864, when they first met. Prince Edward Island hosted the Charlottetown Conference, which was the first meeting in the process leading to the Quebec resolutions and the creation of Canada in 1867. And they met at this place. And I haven't been back to Charlottetown. The last time I was there, they were doing renovations because of COVID. And I really would like to get back to see actually what's in this building, because the stuff I saw was in an annex nearby. But Prince Edward Island, even though they were the host of this conference, they decided, you know what, we're not going to join this new country, and we'll stay a colony of the United Kingdom. But we're not sure we want to be a colony of the United Kingdom. Oh, there's Tim Hortons in downtown Charlottetown. Wherever you go in Canada, there's a Tim Hortons selling you donuts. So I have to take a picture in front of every Tim Hortons. In 1860s, the late 1860s, PEI is in a dither. The colony is examining various options, including becoming a discrete dominion unto itself, as well as entertaining delegations from the United States who are interested in getting Prince Edward Island to join the United States, the Andrew Johnson administration. And PEI officials met with their American counterparts in 1868 to discuss new trade options and maybe joining the United States, but the colony was hampered in negotiating an actual agreement because they still were a British colony, and they couldn't get permission from London to do so. Well, they make potatoes there, so we could have gotten potatoes from PEI as well as Idaho. That is the Confederation Center of the Arts. That is all the flags of all the provinces of Canada. Oh, and every year, this was done in 2016 when I was up there, they do Anne of Green Gables plays every year. In 1871, Prince Edward Island begins the construction of a railroad to go across the island. And that railroad's going to cost them a lot of money, and they don't have the money. And Great Britain says, you know what, we're not paying for this railroad. So again, there are negotiations that begin with the Grant administration, U.S. Grant, President Grant, about Prince Edward Island joining the United States. 1873, the Canadian Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, anxious to thwart American expansionism, and the Americans were expanding. They were in Alaska at this point. And this is another reason the Canadians got quickly into British Columbia. They were afraid the Americans in Alaska would just run through British Columbia and just seize it. That was something that the Canadians worried about until about 1931. They always had plans to go up against Americans in the event America decided to seize the land. 1783, Prince Edward Island joins Canada, and that was on July 1st, the 6th anniversary of Canada. And that's the Confederation Bridge, which now links New Brunswick to PEI. That opened in 1997, and it's now connected to the Canadian mainland. And the first year it was open, they saw nearly double the visitors in 1997 as opposed to 1996, 1.2 million as opposed to 740,000. And Anne of Green Gables, Anne of Green Gables met us over at the pier. It's my wife with Anne of Green Gables. It's funny, I gave this talk on Long Island over in Great Neck at a senior residence. And they said, coincidentally, we're reading Anne of Green Gables now as part of our reading program, Lucy Maud Montgomery. And she was born in Clifton, New London in 1874. She wrote 20 novels, numerous short stories that were collected into anthologies. And you might have the book in your library, as a matter of, or the books in your library. The first Anne book, Anne of Green Gables, published in 1908. The musical play, Anne of Green Gables, has run every year at the Charlottetown Festival for more than 4 decades. Now, some of you, probably the only thing you know about Nova Scotia is Nova Scotia lox. So you could have your bagel, and you could have your cream cheese, and you could have your smoked salmon. But Nova Scotia is more than just lox. Jim Dad. Yeah, I saw Anne of Green Gables. Anyway, if you sail into Sydney, this is what you see. It's a big cello. I have no idea why the cello is a big deal, because that's where Alexander Graham Bell grew up. And you'd figure he'd be a bigger name, right? Because he only invented the telephone. But anyway, you sail into Sydney and you see this big instrument in Sydney, and fiddlers. But anyway, I would think Alexander Graham Bell busted him would be better. Had circumstances been a bit different, it is possible that Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, which was once part of Nova Scotia, could have been one of the first states in the newly formed United States. People in Nova Scotia, remember, Nova Scotia and Massachusetts were next to each other, separated by a river. And there were cousins, and there were families, and families went back and forth and talked to one another. Nova Scotia has quite a bit of history, and it precedes even the American Revolution. The wars, the Titanic rescues, and radio. Quite a bit of history took place prior to the American Revolution on the peninsula that helped shape what we know today as modern Canada and the United States. Alexander Graham Bell lived and worked here. The United States Radio Network, or United States Network Radio, in this case NBC, actually was born in Nova Scotia. It seems that the idea was hatched because of the 1912 Titanic sinking and a thoughtful telegraph operator in New York. And there is the port. Oh, and by the way, that little piece of greenery there, that's George's Island. And let's not beat around the bush here. The English practiced ethnic cleansing in Acadia. And if you were French and you ended up there, and if you happened to survive, you might have ended up in Louisiana. But I'm a little ahead of myself here. Halifax, Nova Scotia's capital city, is the home to the second largest natural harbor in the world. In 1605, French colonists established the first permanent European settlement in the future Canada, first north of Florida at Port Royal, founding what would become known as Acadia. Wars were common, and there were causes for these wars because of the rivalry between the French and the British. The disputes developed over land in the colonies, control of the fur trade in the colonies, which continued to be a problem through the War of 1812, and the balance of power back in Europe. During the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, the British captured Port Royal, the capital of the colony, in the siege. 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht, which concluded the conference, ceded the colony to Great Britain while allowing the Acadians to keep their lands. And this causes a major problem, and this is one of the problems that Canada to this day has not solved. That is Louisbourg, or facsimile of Louisbourg. It's 1/4 the size of the original Louisbourg. It's up in Cape Breton. And that's where the French built the largest fortress in North America back in the 1730s. But getting back to the Treaty of Utrecht, over the next 45 years, the Brits wanted the Acadians, but under one condition. You signed an unconditional oath of allegiance to Britain. And these are French. French hate the Brits, right? They're not doing this. They're not doing it at all. And here are all the wars. The King William's War, 1688 to 1697. Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713. Father Ralph's War, 1722 to 1725. King George's War, 1744, 1748. Father Lee Latour's War, 1749, 1755. And finally, the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, the war that George Washington himself started because he was kind of incompetent. But that's another talk for another day. 1756 to 1763. The King William's War was fought in the New World areas of the Great Lakes, northern New England, upper New York, the Ohio Valley, and the southern frontier. The southern frontier here is the St. Lawrence Seaway. The main result of this war was the French had moved down the Mississippi all the way to New Orleans and built forts all along the way. The Queen Anne and the King George's War, Queen Anne's War and the King George's War, dealt with the Spanish and Austrian successions to the thrones respectively. The areas of fighting, again, the southern frontier, south of the St. Lawrence River. The Quebec, the Lake Champlain, Vermont. That's actually, it was all in New York at that point. Vermont is a weird. What happened there was New Hampshire claimed it, New York claimed it, and then New York got it and then gave it up during the Revolutionary War, and Vermont became a republic for about 17 years. Anyway, the King George's War, the area of fighting was the Ohio Valley, out in the middle of Ohio, the Great Lakes, and Nova Scotia. And the Rock of Gibraltar is involved in it. Wait, how's the Rock of Gibraltar involved? Well, it was involved with all these wars that are being fought in Nova Scotia. The results of these wars were that Britain gained possessions from France in the New World and Spain's possession of Gibraltar. That's Louisbourg. Louisbourg was going to protect the French. They built it, and they built it huge. They went big. In 1730, France finished building the biggest military fortress in the world. Fell in 1758. Louisbourg was captured by the British in 1758 and demolished. And the British went about the job of ethnic cleansing. Meanwhile, not too far from Nova Scotia is Quebec City. And this is where the history of North America changes, or at least the eastern part and the northern part of Northern America. During the 7 Years' War, 1759, the British, under the command of General James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. And you're looking down, Quebec City, top of the cliffs. Now, Quebec City is the only walled city north of Mexico and North America. The French built a wall to a certain extent, and then they didn't. They figured there were cliffs there, and there's no way the British are going to climb up the cliffs and they're going to attack us because the cliffs are so steep. But guess what? The British did so. The city was defended by the French general, the Marquis de Marcon. A very short battle on the Plains of Abraham. If you've ever been to Quebec City, the Plains of Abraham are right behind the Chateau Frontenac. Lasted 15 minutes, culminated in the British victory and the surrender of Quebec. And there is the Plains of Abraham. The British and the French had coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley caused the British to attempt to eradicate, like I said, ethnic cleansing, eradicate New France from the map completely. In the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759, Quebec City was permanently lost by the French. And Louisbourg was lost the year before. In 1763, France formally ceded its claims to Canada, the Quebec City's French-speaking Catholic population, came under the rule of the Protestant British. Britain goes home, most of their troops. The war is done, but the start of the United States can actually be traced to Quebec City's downfall. People in Nova Scotia, well, they're friendly with the people in Massachusetts. They're telling them what is going on in the upper colonies now that the French are gone. And they're going back and forth and back and forth. And on the southern part, the southern colonists are saying, hey, wait a minute. All the best troops are gone? Like, nobody's really controlling them right now? Hey, you know what? Oh, wait a minute. We have to pay for Britain's war? Wait, let's go back. We have to pay for Britain's war? Hey, what happened to Barbados in the Charter of Barbados, 1652? Taxation without representation. They got it. Why not us? The roots. Britain's gone. They have to pay off all the debts from all the wars that they've fought. Most Americans get introduced to Nova Scotia through the poem, Evangeline. Young American elementary school students are introduced to Canada by the poem. Evangeline, The Tale of a Katy, is a poem by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, published in 1847. The poem follows an Acadian girl named Evangeline and her search for her lost love, Gabriel, set during the time of what is called the expulsion of the Acadians. But you never learn about it other than the tale. The expulsion of the Acadians was the forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from what would become Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and also part of Massachusetts. It was all part of an area called Acadia. Some of the Acadians ended up in Louisiana, and with that, they formed American Cajun culture. The expulsion lasted 9 years, 1755 to 1764, occurred during the French and Indian War. Again, it's ethnic cleansing. In all, 14,100 Acadians were in the region. 11,500 were deported, and they went onto this island, George's Island. And if you somehow survived George's Island, your life would get better. But most people never survived George's Island. During the 7 Years' War, 2,000 French sailors were imprisoned on the island after the British victory in the Cape of Battle Race, Newfoundland, which was a territory. Fort Charlotte was one of 4 forts where Acadians were imprisoned over 9 years of the expulsion of the Canadians. According to the historian Ronnie Gilles Leblanc, there were about 1,660 Acadians held prisoner on George's Island during the deportation, with a maximum of 600 prisoners at one time. We're sorry now. And that's Brenda Lee, who's sorry now. You go up and down the Riverwalk in Halifax, and there are all kind of little things like, we're sorry for doing this, we're sorry for doing that, we're sorry for doing this. Hey, look what we did. Oh yeah, we're sorry for that too. But if you look closely, Nova Scotia is literally on the top, blue. And you could see that some of the Nova Scotians ended up back in France. Some of them ended down in Haiti. Some of them ended up in the 13 colonies at that point. The result of the expulsion was the devastation of both the primary civilian population and the economy of the region. Thousands of Acadians died in the expulsions, mainly from diseases and drowning when ships were lost. This is when they got to Louisiana, and this is the Longfellow Evangeline State Historic Site down in Louisiana. And the question is, was it an expulsion or was it ethnic cleansing? Louisiana turned out to be a good thing for the Acadians. Louisiana was transferred to the Spanish government in 1762, but there was good relations between France and Spain. They had a common religion. They were Catholics. And some Acadians actually, after saying no to the British, took the oaths of allegiance to the Spanish government. Soon, Acadians comprised the largest ethnic group in Louisiana. And as for Louisiana seafood, they were heavily involved in the development of the Louisiana seafood industry. The Acadians' migration from Canada was spurred by the 1763 Treaty of Paris, which ended the war. The treaty's terms provided 18 months for unrestrained immigration. Many Acadians moved to the region of Atacapa, which is now in Louisiana, and they traveled via the French colony of Saint Domingue, now Haiti. George's Island. George's Island has quite the history. People really don't want to talk about it. On July 11th, 1764, the British government passed an order in council to permit Acadians to legally return to British territories, provided that they take an unqualified oath of allegiance. Some Acadians returned to Nova Scotia, but they found out, hey, welcome back. Well, guess what? We got your land. And that was the end of that. The Acadian settlers began to cultivate land for agriculture and fish the Gulf of Mexico and the bayous in Louisiana. And they would join the Spanish, Canary Islanders, Native Americans, descendants of African slaves, French Creoles from the Caribbean, all of whom settled in Louisiana during the same time period. Meanwhile, in 1763, most of Acadia, which was Cape Breton Island, St. John's Island, which would become Prince Edward Island in New Brunswick, became part of Nova Scotia. 1769, St. John's Island became a separate colony. So why was Halifax in Nova Scotia important? The port. The port. It's one of the great ports, and it doesn't freeze in the world. It's an ice-free port. Leaves the harbor accessible all year. It's one of the world's deepest harbors. But more importantly, it's the closest North American port to Europe, and the first one that sailors saw during the exploration days. Now, Nova Scotia could have been the 14th colony. After all, there were common people between Massachusetts and Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotians weren't necessarily they weren't too fond of the English. And they are on the fence. Should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? Should we? Hey, you know what? They're demanding that taxation without representation. And you know, when we got rich landowners too, and they could vote and all that other stuff. Yeah, you know what? It might be good for us to go with the Southern colonists. After all, we are attached to Massachusetts, right? We're all, you know, we got a lot of family down south. Washington could have taken Nova Scotia for next to nothing. Yeah, there would be some ammunition involved. And Washington thought, well, should I spend money on ammunition? Do we really need Halifax? Because we got New York, we got Boston, we got Philadelphia. We got Charleston, South Carolina. We got ports. We don't necessarily need Nova Scotia. And, you know, should I or shouldn't I? Should I or shouldn't I spend money? Well, he's also dithering. Nova Scotia, dithering. Should they join the Southern colonies? They're defying Britain. And there were a couple of battles that took place, actually, in Nova Scotia. The Battle of Fort Cumberland in 1776 and the Siege of St. John's in 1777. Ultimately, George Washington said, you know, Benedict Arnold tells me that we don't need to go to Nova Scotia. We should go into Quebec. And if we go into Quebec, we'll end up with Nova Scotia anyway. At least that's what Benedict Arnold told me. And, you know, he's a general and all that. So I'm going to listen to Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold's Continental Army was defeated in Quebec City, and Nova Scotia. There's all kind of scallywags and skullduggery and double dealing in Halifax. The Americans double crossed the Nova Scotians. A whole bunch of things went on. By the end of the war, Nova Scotia outfitted a number of privateers to attack American shipping because the Americans were attacking them. British forces based in Halifax. Washington did not go after the port, which he should have, but he didn't. Succeeded in preventing American support for rebels. There were rebels who wanted to leave Nova Scotia, but Washington decides, I'm not investing the money here. While the British captured many American privateers in battles, such as the naval battle off Halifax in 1782, many more continued attacks on shipping and settlements until the final months of the war. The Americans beat England in Yorktown, Virginia. The war is just about done. England decides, let's pick a fight with France somewhere else. And Nova Scotia is left behind. And it took them another 60 years to figure out exactly what they wanted to do. On September 3rd, 1873, the Treaty of Paris, American and British negotiators signed a treaty ceasing hostilities and recognizing America's independence. The war formally ended in a Paris hotel room on the morning of September 3rd, 1783. Both sides signed the treaty pledging to, let's forget past misunderstandings and differences. The treaty recognized the colonies as the United States of America, established boundaries, guaranteed that both nations would enjoy free passage on the Mississippi River. And Nova Scotia is sitting there saying, hey, what the hell did we do here? We could have been free, but they weren't. Oh, Benedict Arnold. Getting back to Benedict Arnold. He's a New Brunswick hero. Oh, wait a minute. Before I explain how he becomes a New Brunswick hero, the Brits have Nova Scotia. And there are a lot of loyalists to King George III who are trapped in the new United States. And these were the people with money. In fact, 97% of the people in the United States didn't care if they were Brits or Americans. And probably the same held true in what would become the province of Canada. Except New Brunswick was like, are you sure we did the right thing? Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold. So he flees. He ends up in New Brunswick because Nova Scotia split in half. In this place, New Brunswick is formed to house the loyalists who need a place to live. So they end up in New Brunswick. Nova Scotia included the present-day New Brunswick until the establishment of that, what is now a province, in 1784, after the arrival of the United Empire Loyalists. Nova Scotia has been unchanged since then. The United Empire Loyalists lost the American Revolution. 33,000 Tories settled in Nova Scotia on lands granted by the Crown as some compensation for their losses in the southern colonies. Oh, Benedict Arnold. Let's get back to Benedict Arnold. This is Quebec City. Here stood her old and new defenders, united, guarding, saving Canada, defeating Arnold at the Sault-au-Maitre barrack on the last day of 1775, Guy Carleton commanding at Quebec. Benedict Arnold was absolutely convinced the ragtag Americans could beat the Brits. They forgot one thing. It's cold in Quebec. They did not expect to basically run into cold weather in Quebec in December. Oh, it's Benedict Arnold. Oh, anyway, getting back to Benedict Arnold. So he goes up to what is now New Brunswick, no longer Nova Scotia. He and his son, they moved to St. John, New Brunswick, where they speculated in land and established a business doing trade with the West Indies. He purchased large tracts of land, acquired city lots in St. John and Fredericton, but he had to leave with his family, and they returned to London in December 1791. Apparently, he was disliked because of bad business deals, petty lawsuits. I guess once a traitor, always a traitor. Meanwhile, up in Sydney, that's Scotland. And in a lot of ways, it still is Scotland. The Cape Breton Highlanders. The British loyalists fleeing the American Revolution founded Sydney, Nova Scotia in 1785. And this settlement was rich because there were a lot of natural resources there. The natural resources there today have been paved over, and there's a park, children's park, on top of whatever toxic stew is underneath the earth up there. In its industrial heyday, jobs in the steel factory, coal mines, attracted settlers from many lands, including those who emigrated from the Scottish Highlands, including a family called the Bells. Their influence is still evident. Cape Breton is one of the rare places in North America where Gaelic is still spoken and Celtic music is heard everywhere. Meanwhile, down in Halifax, well, it's time to build something up to protect the city of Nova Scotia. And they build the Citadel, the National Historic Site. It has a strategic hilltop location, a commanding view of the Halifax harbor, and was chosen in 1749. And by the way, they have the cannons still up there, and they point directly at the cruise ships, which may be trying to tell us something. Anyway, for the fort designed to protect the city. Erected between 1826 and 1856 on Halifax highest hill, it still dominates the skyline as Canada's most visited National Historic Site, remains a magnet for tourists. The present citadel, with its dry moat and stone ramparts, was the fourth defensive structure to be built on the site, formerly linked to smaller forts and gun emplacements on harbor islands in the bluffs above the harbor entrance. By the way, the British moved their stock of ammunition during the War of 1812 from Halifax to Hamilton, Bermuda, because they weren't sure that the Americans still didn't want Nova Scotia. And there is the citadel and the guy protecting the citadel. Canada, about 60, or the people now living in what is Canada, was Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, they decided, you know what? We might have made a big mistake by not going with the Americans. We need to get out of this deal with Britain. The Americans were smart. They got a deal. Of course, they had the two wars between the American Revolution and also the War of 1812. And they were also fighting out west over the land north of California all the way up to Alaska. Maybe we should have gotten out of this deal back then. But let's see if we could get out of the deal now. During the rebellions of 1837 and 1838 in Upper and Lower Canada, hundreds of armed citizens rose against the government, protesting the injustices of the ruling elite and demanding changes in the politics and the economic of imperial rule in British North America. Sounds a lot like what was going on in 1773 in Boston. The revolt in Lower Canada was more serious and more violent than the rebellion in Upper Canada. In 1839, Lord Durham just throws more gasoline on the fire. He does a report on the rebellion. In 1838, the British politician Lord Durham was sent to British North America to investigate the causes of the rebellions, 1737-38, in the colonies of Upper and Lower Canada. Durham's report on the affairs of the British North America led to a series of reforms and changes. These included united the two Canadas into a single colony, the province of Canada, in 1841. Durham proposed the creation of municipal governments and a Supreme Court in the British North American colonies. He also wanted to resolve the land question in Prince Edward Island. And he had a plan for the union of all the BNA colonies. But Nova Scotia wasn't very interested. Again, 60 years earlier or so, they could have gone with the colonists. And they're still trying to figure out what is really our relationship with England. They and New Brunswick, which obviously is part of Nova Scotia, they're not interested in this BNA union. But it all goes back to Quebec, and there's Wolfe, and there's Montcalm, 1759. Durham believed that the problems in mostly French Lower Canada were ethnic in nature, not political. He found two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. And Durham was culturally biased against the French Canadians, called them a people with no literature, no history. He recommended assimilating them by uniting the Canadas in a way that would allow the English-speaking majority in Upper Canada to dominate. Durham's report was condemned by Upper Canada's Tory elite. Reformers in Upper Canada and Nova Scotia hailed the idea of responsible government. They wanted responsible government in Nova Scotia. By the way, New Brunswick is the only province in Canada where there are two official languages provincially, English and French. In Quebec, it's French. Nova Scotia, it's English. The rest of the country, it's English. Nova Scotia finally, about 75 years after the Boston Tea Party, decides we got to get out of here. And they become the first colony in British North America and in the British Empire to achieve responsible government in February 1848, and become self-governing through the efforts of Joseph Howe. Nova Scotia had established representative government in 1858. Again, another picture of the citadel. The Civil War in Nova Scotia is quite interesting. interesting history here. Thousands of Nova Scotians, still probably figuring we should have gone to the United States, fought in the American Civil War for 4 years, 1861 to 1865, primarily on behalf of the North. The British Empire, including Nova Scotia, declared itself neutral in the conflict, but the Brits were kind of helping the South. But they looked at it, well, we got to do business with both, right? So Britain, Nova Scotia continued to trade with both the South and the North. And there's one of the ships, of the Confederate ships, the CSS Tallahassee in the Halifax Harbor, 1864. Civil War in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia's economy boomed during the Civil War. Halifax was a main hub for the U.S. Confederate shipping cotton to England. Most British North Americans or Canadians were anti-slavery. After all, the Brits got rid of slavery in the 1830s. And most Canadian agriculture and manufacturing groups went to the north. And there was this, the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad didn't just stop in New York, didn't just stop in Maine. It went into the British North American territories. The Underground Railroad was a secret network of abolitionists. They helped African Americans escape from enslavement in the American South to the free northern states or to Canada. The Underground Railroad was the largest anti-slavery freedom movement in North America. It brought between 30,000 and 40,000 fugitives to British North America, including Nova Scotia, and they were not returned to the United States. They stayed there. Africville was an African-Canadian village located just north of Halifax, founded in the mid-18th century. The city of Halifax demolished the once prosperous seaside community in the 1960s in what many said was an act of racism. The mayor of Halifax, the Halifax Regional Municipality, apologized for what happened in 2010. For many people, Africville represents the oppression faced by Black Canadians in their efforts to right history's wrongs. You go through Canada, there was suppression of the French, suppression of the First Nations, suppression of Black Canadians. And First Nations is a big problem. In fact, actually ended up at a conference not far from Sudbury. We did a Great Lakes cruise where we listened to this guy talking about First Nations and alcoholism and living on the reservations. Oh, Bruce Morton knows his relative. Norman McLean was a guy who I worked with in New York. Bruce worked with him in New York. He was a sports writer. He was a guy who used to sell sports memorabilia and a whole bunch of other things. But Norman McLean's telling me the story one day about his great uncle, Wilmer McLean, in the Civil War. The McLean family, most of them fled to Truro, Nova Scotia, but not Wilmer. Wilmer's an interesting story. He's a mere footnote in the Civil War, but an important footnote. See, the Civil War started on his property at Bull Run in Virginia in 1861. And it ended on his property in 1865 at Appomattox. His family, like many others in the Confederate States, fled to Nova Scotia, but not him. This guy, Norman, who I worked with, and Bruce, who's here, knows him as well, or knew him as well. He passed away about 2014, I believe. So they ended up in Truro, and he ended up coming back to New York. Wilmer McLean's family, his home, was looted by General Ulysses Grant and his officers. He'd live out his life in Virginia. He was connected with the post office. He even got a pension. And his heirs sued the United States to get back their property. They wanted their property back. But it's not a museum. It's in a warehouse in Cleveland. And last I checked with one of the McLeans, they were still suing. They want the property back. But that's the oddity of the Civil War. A very strange tale, Wilmer McLean. The war started on his land and ended on his land. Meanwhile, there was something else that was going on. The Colored Hockey League. The National Hockey League had its first African-Canadian player in 1958. But there were people like Oscar Carnegie, who was from up there, who could have played in the NHL back in the 1940s, but he ended up playing in Atlantic City in the Eastern Hockey League. The owners wouldn't touch him, but he was a really, really good hockey player. The Colored Hockey League of the Maritimes was an all-black ice hockey league founded in Nova Scotia in 1895, and it featured teams from across Canada's maritime provinces, which are New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and now Newfoundland. That's Atlantic Canada. The league operated for several decades, lasting until 1930. Now, what was this league all about? Well, the pastor, James Borden of the Dartmouth Church, James A.R. Kinney, a lawyer and community leader, James Robinson Johnston, and a lawyer, and a Pan-American organizer, Henry Sylvester Williams, put the league together. They weren't necessarily there to play hockey. They wanted young black men to go to church every Sunday and said, if you come to church, we'll have a hockey game afterwards. And that is what happened. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, with the influence of black nationalism movement and rising interest in the sport of hockey, the league came to be seen as a potential driving force for the equality of black Canadians. A nation, but not quite. Soon after the American Civil War, the pro-Canadian Confederation premier, Charles Tupper, led Nova Scotia into the Canadian Confederation July 1st, 1867, along with New Brunswick and the province of Canada, which is Quebec and Ontario. Almost 3 months later, in the election of September 18th, 1867, the Anti-Confederation Party won 18 of 19 federal seats and 36 out of 38 seats in the provincial legislature, and Canada was born. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec are in. Prince Edward Island is not. Oddly enough, the next one in would be British Columbia, and that's because they didn't want the drunken Americans from Alaska and Washington invading, so they joined Canada. Alexander Graham Bell was an immigrant. He was from Scotland, and he ended up in Cape Breton. In 1871, while living in Nova Scotia up in Cape Breton, Bell started working on the harmonic telegraph, a device that allowed multiple messages to be transmitted over a wire at the same time. While trying to perfect this technology, which was backed by a group of investors, Bell became preoccupied with finding a way to transmit human voice over wires. And we ended up with that, the Bell system. Bell was born in Scotland, but was raised in Cape Breton, and he would work on his invention at his homes in Nova Scotia and in the United States in the Boston area. On March 7, 1876, Bell was granted U.S. patent 174465A for a method of transmitting speech by telegraphy. In Boston, the first telephone call was made on March 10, 1876. First word said, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Hey, man, he's got his own phone. You'd think he'd want it in his office, right? You'd think he'd want that phone, right? And he had a phone up there in Baddock, Nova Scotia. That's now a museum. Bell died up there on August 2nd, 1922 at the age of 75. But he didn't have a telephone in his room. No. He didn't have a telephone in his room, which leads me to believe that he probably wouldn't have one of these in his room either, fearing that it would distract him from his scientific work. No party line for Alexander Graham Bell. The Titanic sunk not too far from Halifax. And believe it or not, the Titanic may have started radio in the United States. The Titanic in U.S. radio? How does that come about? The Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax has an exhibit dedicated to the sinking of the Titanic, where there is a deck chair from the ship, one of the few in the world still intact, on display. Other Titanic artifacts are housed there, including oak molding from the first forward-class staircase. And there is my old Grundig radio. It comes from 1951. Yeah, it has an electric cord and all that, but also has tubes in there. So I never listened to it. And actually, it was a good radio. It had shortwave, it had FM, it had AM, it had everything that you'd want in the radio. But I can't put it on, because what if the old tubes blow? I can't replace it. So it just sits and people before COVID who used to come over and say, hey, is that thing play? I said, yeah, but I'm not playing it. Why not? Because it's got tubes. And one blows, I can't play it anymore. In 1912, David Sarnoff managed the Marconi wireless station at the Wanamaker's department store in New York City. On the evening of April 14, 1912, the ocean liner, the Titanic, struck an iceberg, started taking on water. And there was Sarnoff working at the Marconi station at the Wanamaker's store in Lower Manhattan. For those of you who don't know what Wanamaker's was, it was a department store in Philadelphia, New York. There was one in New Jersey, one in Yonkers. And that was it, Wanamaker's. And they also sponsored the John Wanamaker's Mile at the Milrose Games at Madison Square Garden in the 1980s. Almost immediately, the ship began transmitting distress signals. Soon, the airways were flooded with news of the disaster as operators tracked the rescue effort. After 3 days at his Wanamaker's post, Sarnoff traveled to Marconi Seagate Station on Coney Island and contacted the steamship, the Carpathia, which picked up survivors from the Titanic and was returning to New York. Sarnoff proceeded to compile the names of those passengers and forwarded the news to their families. And he begins to think, somehow, could I commercialize this? Could I get a piece of the spectrum from the government? If I got a piece of the spectrum, can I go back and forth with radio stations and entertain the public? Yeah, I mean, there are people who have radio stations now, but they just talk to one another. Let me think about this. Let me think about it. Congress didn't want to regulate the airwaves, but this disaster gives them an opportunity to pass the Radio Act of 1912. The law divided the electromagnetic spectrum between amateur government and commercial users and mandated that all American operators, even experienced ones like David Sarnoff, had to be licensed. I don't know if I should confess this or not, but I was on radio without a third-class license. I don't know if that means anything today, but back when I started in the 1970s, gotta get that license. But I'm doing news. Gotta get that license. Gotta get that license. I never got that license, and I was on radio. I don't know if I should confess it, but I figure the statute of limitations are over. To accommodate the demand for trained wireless experts, the Marconi Company recruited Sarnoff to act as an instructor at a newly organized technical institute. Eventually, Sarnoff would start the NBC network. But before he did that, the Radio Corporation of America, of which he was part of, had to do two things. They had to mass produce the radiola, which they did, and they had to come up with programming so people would buy the radiola. And people bought the radiola in mass by 1924. And this was the final product. Boom, boom, boom. Three little tones, NBC. Garrett Morris actually did the whole song on Saturday Night Live in the mid-1970s. NBC Red and NBC Blue. The sinking of the Titanic brought radio into the public spotlight and prompted U.S. Congress to regulate the medium for the first time. Sarnoff would refer to this incident as an important turning point in his career. The Titanic disaster brought radio to the front and, incidentally, me. The harbor explosion, December 6, 1917. And I was there in 2017 when they just about completed all the work that they had to do for the 100th anniversary of this explosion. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of this explosion. If you did, put it in the chat. But this explosion was the largest man-made explosion on record until the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 with the atomic bomb. It's December 6, 1917. A French munition ship collides with a steamer. The Mont Blanc blew up with more than 2,000 casualties and leveling a part of the city. Boston sent aid. There are ferries between Halifax and Boston. There are ferries between Halifax and Portland. Boston sent aid, and to this day receives an annual Christmas tree as thanks for helping out in the Halifax explosion. That is what the explosion looked like. The largest man-made explosion to the time. 1,600 people were killed instantly. 9,000 people injured. more than 300 of whom would die later. Every building within a 2.6 kilometer or 1.6 mile radius, 12,000 in all, were destroyed or badly damaged. That is a memorial. That picture was taken in October 2017. That is the memorial for those who were killed in the blast. Hundreds of people who had been watching the fire from their homes were blinded when the blast shattered windows in front of them. And if you look today, those houses are absolutely fortified. That's the neighborhood, and those are the new houses that were built, and that's about a mile and a half away from the blast. An extensive comparison of 130 major explosions by Halifax historian Jay White in 1994 concluded that Halifax Harbor remains unchallenged. The overall magnitude, as long as 5 criteria are considered together: number of casualties, force of the blast, radius of devastation, quantity of explosive material, and total value of property destroyed. For many years afterwards, the Halifax explosion was the standard by which all blasts were measured. For instance, in its report on the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Time wrote that the explosive power of the little boy bomb was 7 times that of the explosion. And that is the Halifax-Portland Ferry. Before I end this, I want to, it's not part of the PowerPoint, but I'll add it right now. There is a museum in the port of Halifax, and it's sort of the Ellis Island of Canada. When immigrants were coming over, they were coming over to the United States in Boston, New York, Galveston, Texas. And they were also coming over yes, Pier 21. They were also coming over to Canada in St. John and Halifax. In fact, Louis B. Mayer came in St. John. Generally, he came to Halifax or St. John, and you moved west to Montreal. But the United States put quotas on immigration in 1924 and really blocked a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe in 1924. But Canada continued to take in people until 1933. Then they put a quota system in. People like William Shatner. William Shatner's family came in through Canada, along with other people, including Monty Hall, Lorne Greene, Louis B. Mayer, and it was a major embarkation area or debarkation area for people coming from Europe into Canada. Now, the Chinese helped build the railroad in Canada, and they came in through British Columbia. But Pier 21 is an interesting place. It's in the Halifax harbor, and it's worthwhile. It's the Ellis Island there. Anyway, anybody for any bagel, cream cheese, and lox? Because chances are that lox came from just outside. Now, the Maritimes are known for fishing, but there's also oil. There is oil off of the Nova Scotia coastline. Halifax was prior to COVID-19, the fastest growing area in Canada. It's a nice little town. There's a lot of universities there. There are a lot of pubs, a lot of restaurants, and there's the old Main Street, which is now being renovated, where all the businesses were. That was killed off when they built the waterfront area, which is really a nice area. But basically, for the Maritimes, it's all about fishing. And I once had to go to the UN, and the prime minister, or rather the premier of Newfoundland, was taking his case to the United Nations against the United States, saying the United States is fishing all the fish off of Newfoundland, and there was nothing left. And the United States gets into these battles with Canada over lumber and over fish. Nova Scotia is a rather interesting place. It could have been a part of America, but George Washington listened to Benedict Arnold. Actually, Prince Edward Island could have been part of the United States, and also New Brunswick. Halifax was among the fastest growing areas in Canada. It was outpacing Vancouver, which was the fastest growing area in Canada, because Vancouver had become far too expensive, and And you go over to Halifax, yeah, it's a little colder in Halifax than it is in Vancouver, but you don't have to worry about snow. It doesn't, they get snowstorms there, but it's not as big, right? George Washington didn't think that Halifax was worth the effort or worth the money and ammunition. Yeah, and he also knew that Nova Scotians, they really want to become a 14th colony. Never happened, though. Prince Edward Island tried to become a member of the United States in 1868, 1871, 1872, but it never happened. There's a lot of history in Nova Scotia, an awful lot of history, and it can be argued that the American Revolution starts in Quebec and in Nova Scotia. The Southern colonists went ahead with their rebellion. People in Upper Canada and Lower Canada didn't. I want to thank Stephen for inviting me, and we say goodbye to Halifax and goodbye to Moosehead Beer. And the Halifax junior hockey team is called the Mooseheads after the beer.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you everybody for.
We're back next month,
and we hope to see you on the next lecture. And
when am I back here? When am I back here? I'm back next month for you, right?
Yeah, we have the rock and roll. We have yeah, the music, the rock and roll, the 50s.
Well, the early days of rock and roll with including my buddy Dave Somerville, Diamond Dave from Toronto. Dave Somerville, who had the hit Little Darling.
That should be a good one. Very good one. We look forward to that.
Yep.
Well, everybody, have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you again.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And thank everybody else who has been here tonight. Hope you enjoyed it and hope to see you next month. Enjoy the night.